Thank you for watching this video. Today, I'd like to talk to you about my book, The Dutch Language in Japan, 1600 to 1900. It was published in hardback and ebook in 2020 and will be published in paperback in November 2022. In this presentation, I want to highlight several of the distinctive features of this book, which I hope will recommend it to you. These include the structure of the book, which is innovative, the indexes, which are quite comprehensive, my work on lexical contact phenomena, which arose because of contact between Dutch and Japanese, the topic of how Dutch toponyms were rendered in Japanese, maps of the Low Countries and elsewhere outside East Asia, and a Dutch Ainu Japanese dictionary, which is one of several examples of rare manuscripts that I discuss in the book and which have not previously been analysed in secondary literature. I should say that the book is primarily aimed at Dutch studies scholars, with the goal of illustrating that the history of the Dutch language goes far beyond the Low Countries. I do, though, hope that it will be of use to Japanologists and others in East Asian area studies. I've had an offer to translate the book into Korean. An innovative feature of this book is its structure. The book has received praise from Rainier Salverde of University College London for the clarity of its structure. The analytical tool that I've used to tell the story of the language of Dutch in Japan is language process. Given that this is a book about language contact, this may seem a somewhat obvious analytical tool for this purpose. However, as far as I know, it has not previously been used in the manner in which I use it in this book. Chapter 1 analyses who already knew Dutch in Japan. I divide these people, almost always men, into three groups. First, those from the Low Countries, whose first language was Dutch. Second, Europeans from outside the Low Countries who knew Dutch. This group includes Germans such as Engelbert Kempfer and Philip von Siebold, and the Swede Carl Peter Thunberg, all of whom were physicians. Third, people from outside Europe who knew Dutch, such as servants and slaves from the East Indies and South Asia. Chapter 2 analyses how the Japanese learned Dutch. Some groundwork on learning materials and lexicons has been done by Henk de Groot. I added to this describing the development of shijuku, or private schools, at which Dutch and Dutch studies were taught, and making extensive use of the Decima Dagregister and other sources to analyse how Dutchmen on Decima instructed Japanese in the language. Chapter 3 analyses the many ways in which Dutch was used in Japan. These include speaking Dutch, rangaku, record keeping, correspondence, printing Dutch books, code switching, spielerij, Dutch text in Japanese fine art, Dutch text on everyday objects, material culture, Dutch in Japanese maps, and the collection of Dutch books by Japanese. Chapter 4 explores which languages Dutch came into contact with in Japan and what the nature and consequences of that contact were. Apart from Japanese, these languages were Portuguese, Latin, Malay, Sinitic varieties, classical Chinese and local Chinese dialects spoken by traders in Nagasaki, Korean, Ainu, Russian, Manchu, English, French, and German. Whilst contact with Portuguese was strong in the 17th century, even after the Portuguese were definitively expelled from Japan in 1639, it waned over time. Contact with English, French and German, on the other hand, grew towards the end of the period under review, especially after the Phaeton incident in 1808, in which a British frigate entered Nagasaki Bay and raise questions about Japan's ability to defend itself. Chapter 5 analyses which Japanese words were used in Dutch texts and how these words were modified. The insertion of these words occurred for two reasons, which were somewhat interrelated. First, it could be part of a speaker's discourse strategy to distinguish himself from other authors or speakers. And second, it could be for gap filling, where there was no equivalent in the matrix language, in this case Dutch. The book analyses gap filling by theme, for example, coins, weights and measures, and modes of transport. It analyses the role that differences in the Dutch and Japanese phonemic and phonotactic systems played in how Japanese words were integrated into Dutch texts. For example, there is no hard G in Dutch. Kago, meaning palanquin, Dutch draagstoel, was often written as kango. This may have been done to keep the G hard in Dutch g, or possibly to reflect the fact that the G was nasalized. The lack of the phoneme ch in the native Dutch phonemic set helps to explain why edomachi was written jedomats in Dutch texts. Chapter 6 analyses the history of translation from Dutch to Japanese and other target languages such as Kanbun. As a framework, it uses a series of questions posed by Peter Burke in analysing translation in early modern Europe. Who translates, what, for whom, in what manner, and with what consequences? Over 1,000 Dutch texts were translated into Japanese and, in a few cases, Kanbun. The reception of these texts would have consequences for Japanese society and culture, Japanese political life, and the Japanese language. Chapter 7 analyses three types of interference in Japanese resulting from contact with Dutch: lexical, grammatical, and graphic. This is the longest chapter. I return shortly to my analysis of lexical interference. Grammatical interference included the introduction of particles, such as tokoro no from Kanbun, and the emergence of niyote, which was used to translate the Dutch door to indicate the agent in passive sentences. As for graphic interference, some Japanese learnt to write the horizontal script, and several Japanese advocated the adoption of romaji to replace the existing writing system. Chapter 8, on language shift and recession, charts the final stages of the story of Dutch as the dominant European language in Japan. It identifies three stages in the process of language shift away from Dutch as an L2 or L3 in Japan. Stage 1, from the early 19th century until 1854, when Japanese began to learn other European languages apart from Dutch. Stage 2, from 1854 to 1868, when Dutch gained some ground as a lingua franca between Japanese and Europeans. And Stage 3, with the advent of the Meiji era, when there was a definitive shift towards other European languages, above all English, French and German. In 1888, a quadrilingual dictionary of physics was published in Japan. Tellingly, it included terms in Japanese, English and French and German, but not in Dutch. The second distinctive feature of the book is its indexes. Let me quote from 3 reviews of the book. Rainier Salverda of University College London writes, "The many interesting results Joby has produced in the pursuit of this new multidisciplinary approach to the case of Rangaku are underpinned by a formidable scholarly apparatus." Martina van Ittersum of Dundee writes, "The monograph's Index of Japanese Primary Sources by title reveals the bountiful harvest of centuries of Rangaku." And regarding the wide range of primary and secondary sources used in the book, Joop van der Horst of KU Leuven writes, and I translate, "In general, one can say that Joby offers the praiseworthy combination of the very extensive use of secondary literature on the one hand and many primary sources that he has identified on the other." Besides an extensive bibliography, the book has 4 indexes. an index of Japanese and Chinese names, an index of Japanese primary sources by title, an index of non-Japanese and non-Chinese names, and an index of subjects and places. Let's just focus for a minute on the first two of these. For the Japanese and Chinese names, I give dates of birth and death and names in Sinitic characters. Unfortunately, not all books on this subject do this, which can make it difficult to know sometimes which Japanese the author is referring to. For the index of Japanese primary sources by title, I give the Romaji and Kanji titles, English translation, and date of publication, together with the National Institute of Japanese Literature, the NIJL, and Waseda University Library references, and where appropriate, the Kurlan and Serurier numbers for reference in Leiden and other libraries in the Netherlands. Again, with other books on this subject which do not give these references, it is sometimes difficult to pin down which work the author is referring to, especially as some books have very similar titles. The section which is probably of most interest to linguists is on the outcomes of lexical interference or lexical contact phenomena in Chapter 7. Let me quote from Joop van der Horst's review again. This is, let's say, the most sociolinguistic chapter of the book. It is also, it seems, the chapter where most specialist literature and previous studies are analysed. Joby gives a careful account of these. He also addresses several difficult terminological and methodological issues and provides a long list of sources. In addition, he discusses loanwords, loan translations, and other lexical contact phenomena. I used many primary and secondary sources for this chapter. One secondary source that I used was an article by the Leiden professor of Japanese, Fritz Voss. The article, Dutch Influences on the Japanese Language, was first published in 1963 and was republished in 2014. For its time, it was groundbreaking. However, as it is now nearly 60 years old, I needed to rework much of the material. I added the source, i.e. the Japanese text or texts in which the word first appears, the date of first use, Japanese characters, loan translations, and hybrid words, and I analysed loan words by theme rather than simply alphabetical order, which was Fritz Voss's approach. As I've already suggested, there are several types of lexical contact phenomena. These 2 pages illustrate 2 types of contact phenomena. One is usually described as loanwords. Biru is often cited as a famous Dutch loanword in Japanese. It has undergone slight phonemic substitution to account for the fact that Japanese words do not end in R, and the basic phonotactic patterns in Japanese are vowel or consonant-vowel. Other loanwords under food and drink include araku, bisuketto, hammo, and kohi. If we look at hammo, we see it comes from the Dutch ham. It first appears in 1798 in Bango-sen by Morishima Churyo, aka Katsuragawa Hosan. It is listed there as a foreign word, which would become integrated into Japanese. The Japanese equivalent is given as rakan. Subsequently, many compound words, including ham, have emerged in Japanese. Many scientific words in Japanese are loan translations from Dutch. Japanese translators took Dutch words and translated them on a morpheme by morpheme basis. I list 122 such words under headings such as chemistry, grammatical terms, and medicine and anatomy. If we take horsepower, this is pariki in Japanese. This is a loan translation of the Dutch paardenkracht, literally horsepower. The first use in a Japanese text was in 1851 as Bano Riki. The book offers new insights into subjects that have previously received little academic attention. One example is toponyms. As Joop van der Horst notes, to name something I would never have thought of myself, but Chris Joby did, names on geographical maps. Several examples come from Kutsuki Masatsune's Taisei Yochi Zusetsu, illustrated explanation of Western geography, Can 15, map of the Low Countries with Dutch and Flemish toponyms in Japanese. Here, the names of towns and provinces in the Low Countries are typically transliterated into katakana, adapted to Japanese phonology. Brabant is rendered as Burabanto, and Frisia, Friesland, as Frisurando. Rivers are rendered in a combination of katakana and kanji. The river Rhine, the Dutch Rijn, is rendered with Rijn in katakana and a kanji for river, pronounced Rheingauer. Seas are typically rendered in kanji. The Zuiderzee, literally the Southern Sea, is rendered as Nankai, literally South Sea, whilst the North Sea, Noordzee in Dutch, is rendered as Hokkai, literally North Sea. These examples illustrate Kutsuki Masatsune's innovative approach to providing Japanese equivalents for Dutch toponyms. They illustrate how the Japanese appropriated and adapted toponyms from Dutch and other European maps for their own maps of the world outside East Asia. Maps of Europe often use Dutch names for countries, such as Oostenrijke for Oostenrijk for Austria, and of course the Japanese name for Germany, Duitzu, comes from Duitsland. Rainier Salverde writes, Chapter 4, Language Contact, presents what is the central issue of the book, with a fascinating series of portraits of the languages then coexisting with Dutch in Japan. Japanese, Portuguese, Latin, Malay, Sinitic varieties, Korean, Ainu, German, Russian, Manchu, French, and English. In the case of Ainu, one manuscript I identified was a Dutch Ainu-Japanese dictionary. Here is a page listing the numbers 1 to 6 in these three languages. The Ainu numbers differ somewhat from those in the famous Ainu-Japanese English dictionary published by the English missionary John Batchelor in 1905. This, I hope, would be of interest to Ainu experts as well as Japanologists. This is one of several manuscripts described in my book which have not previously been published or analysed in academic literature. It is an excellent example of the riches in Leiden University Library's manuscript collection. To conclude, in November 2022, next month, a paperback edition will be published of my book by Brill, priced €49. Thank you very much for watching, and do send any comments about this video or my book to me at christopherjoby@gmail.com. Thank you and goodbye.